The morning of December 7, 1941, began like any other in Hawaii, but by nightfall, the world had changed forever. Smoke rose in thick columns from battleships, explosions echoed across Pearl Harbor, and Americans learned, in stunned disbelief, that the Japanese Imperial Navy had launched a surprise attack on the United States. Over 2,400 servicemen and civilians were killed, nearly 20 ships were damaged or destroyed, and hundreds of planes lay in ruins on the tarmac. For decades, the United States had remained largely isolated from Europe and Asia's brewing conflicts, focusing on domestic recovery from the Great Depression. Isolationism had dominated policy debates, and public opinion had leaned against involvement in foreign wars. But in the span of a few hours, that cautious stance evaporated. The attack on Pearl Harbor became the clarion call that propelled the United States into the global conflict it had long resisted, marking the moment when a regional strike transformed into a world war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, facing Congress the next day, described the attack as a date which will live in infamy, and the nation responded with an unprecedented surge of unity and determination. Americans from every walk of life enlisted or contributed to the war effort, factories shifted to wartime production, and a sense of purpose permeated the national consciousness. The United States, once an observer on the world stage, now assumed the role of a decisive actor, balancing the immense challenges of modern warfare with the enormous industrial capacity that would soon define its strategic advantage. Yet, entering the war was only the beginning. The true test lay in navigating the complexities of a conflict that spanned oceans, continents, and ideologies, and in forging alliances with nations whose interests were not always aligned. Early in the conflict, U.S. military planners faced difficult decisions. Europe and North Africa demanded attention as German forces occupied vast territories, while the Pacific theater burned with Japanese expansion. The debate over strategy became one of the defining discussions of the early war years. Military leaders and politicians wrestled with the question, should the United States prioritize defeating Germany in Europe first, or focus on the pressing threat posed by Japan in the Pacific? Ultimately, the Europe First strategy was adopted, reflecting the judgment that Germany posed the greater long-term danger to global stability and that defeating Hitler would pave the way for eventual victory against Japan. This decision would guide U.S. military operations, shaping deployments, resource allocation, and the timing of critical campaigns for the remainder of the war. As the United States mobilized, diplomacy became as critical as battlefield tactics. Roosevelt understood that success depended on forging and maintaining a coalition capable of defeating Axis powers. Relations with Britain, led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, required constant negotiation and trust building, even amid ideological differences. By 1943, Allied leaders convened the Tehran Conference, their first meeting face-to-face, to plan the next stages of the war. Roosevelt and Churchill sought to reassure Stalin of a second front in Western Europe, a promise that would materialize as Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, while Stalin emphasized the need to secure Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. The conference demonstrated both the challenges and the importance of high-level diplomacy. Shared goals required compromise, careful persuasion, and an awareness of post-war implications, even as men and women fought and died on distant battlefields. While Allied leaders negotiated, American forces began demonstrating the effectiveness of industrial mobilization and innovation. Factories once producing consumer goods were converted into arms manufacturing centers, producing aircraft, tanks, ships, and weapons on a scale unmatched in history. Technological advancements, from radar to code breaking, gave the United States and its allies critical advantages, allowing them to anticipate enemy movements, coordinate complex operations, and strike with precision. In Europe, American soldiers trained in preparation for amphibious assaults, urban combat, and coordinated attacks alongside British and Canadian troops. The challenges were immense: harsh climates, entrenched enemy positions, and the logistical nightmare of supplying forces thousands of miles from home tested military ingenuity and perseverance. In the Pacific, the lessons were equally harsh. The Philippines fell in 1942, and the infamous Bataan Death March highlighted both Japanese ruthlessness and the extraordinary resilience of Allied troops. Naval engagements such as the Battle of Midway in June 1942 shifted momentum, showcasing the value of intelligence and aircraft carrier-based warfare. The U.S. adopted an island-hopping strategy, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions to capture strategically important islands, gradually closing in on Japan's home islands. Every operation demanded new tactics, courage under fire, and adaptation to environmental and cultural conditions unique to the Pacific. Disease, terrain, and isolation compounded the physical dangers of combat, proving that victory required more than firepower alone. It required endurance, coordination, and a relentless determination to succeed against a determined enemy. Domestically, the United States underwent profound social and economic transformations. Millions of men and women joined the armed forces, while those on the home front filled factories, offices, and farms, sustaining the war effort. The war accelerated movements for civil rights, particularly for African Americans and women, who sought recognition and equality through their contributions to the nation's defense. The V campaign, victory abroad against fascism and victory at home against racial injustice, highlighted the contradictions and aspirations of a nation fighting for freedom overseas while confronting inequality domestically. Simultaneously, propaganda, rationing, and patriotic campaigns mobilized public sentiment, fostering a collective commitment to the cause that stretched across cities, towns, and rural areas alike. By 1943, the United States had evolved from a reluctant participant into a central force capable of shaping the course of the war. Military successes in North Africa, strategic victories in the Pacific, and a growing capacity for coordinated Allied action reflected the country's emergence as a global power. Roosevelt's leadership, emphasizing coalition building, strategic foresight, and the integration of military and industrial resources, positioned the United States not merely as a participant but as a decisive actor in determining the outcome of World War II. The challenges remained immense, but the momentum had shifted. The Allies were no longer merely reacting to Axis initiatives, they were setting the agenda, planning operations that would liberate occupied territories, and ultimately preparing for the invasion of Europe that would turn the tide of history. The entry of the United States into World War II was more than a military decision, it represented a profound shift in national identity and global responsibility. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor to the coordinated strategies with Britain and the Soviet Union, America demonstrated the power of mobilization, innovation, and diplomacy. Every ship launched, every plane deployed, and every soldier trained reflected a nation awakening to its potential and embracing its role as a guardian of a world under siege. The story of 1941 to 1943 set the stage for the campaigns that would follow, revealing a country transformed by urgency, strategy, and the indomitable will to prevail. It was a time when decisions made in Washington, Tehran, and distant battlefields intertwined, forging a path that would lead to victory and forever alter the United States' place in the world. Forging the Second Front and the European campaigns. By early 1944, the tension in Allied headquarters was palpable. Roosevelt, Churchill, and their military advisors had spent months planning the long-awaited invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. The promise made to Stalin at Tehran, the establishment of a second front, was about to be realized. For the American military, this was not simply another battle, it was the culmination of years of preparation, testing both the logistical might of the United States and the cohesion of the Allied coalition. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen from across the country had trained tirelessly, mastering amphibious assaults, mechanized warfare, and combined operations alongside British and Canadian troops. Every detail of Operation Overlord, later known as D-Day, required precision, coordination, and an understanding that failure could prolong the war by years. The months leading up to June 1944 were a study in patience, strategy, and deception. The Allies launched a complex misinformation campaign, convincing the Germans that the primary invasion would occur at the Pas-de-Calais region rather than Normandy. Inflatable tanks, fake radio transmissions, and false troop movements all contributed to the elaborate ruse. American soldiers, meanwhile, endured grueling exercises in southern England, learning to navigate treacherous beaches, storm coastal defenses, and adapt to the unpredictable weather of the Channel. Generals like Dwight D. Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and George S. Patton orchestrated a delicate balance between secrecy and preparation, aware that the success of the operation rested on timing, coordination, and morale. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the invasion began. Thousands of Allied planes roared across the sky, dropping paratroopers behind enemy lines while tens of thousands of troops stormed the beaches. Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Each beach represented a unique challenge, with cliffs, mines, barbed wire, and entrenched German forces awaiting the assault. The fighting was brutal, the sea itself seemed to resist the landings, waves tossing landing crafts and men alike. Casualties mounted, yet the relentless determination of the soldiers carried them forward. The success of D-Day was not guaranteed by strategy alone, it was achieved through courage, improvisation, and sheer human will in the face of overwhelming danger. As the beachheads were secured, the Allies pressed inland, facing fierce German resistance. Towns and villages became battlegrounds, with street-to-street fighting and booby-trap defenses testing every ounce of training and resilience. American divisions advanced alongside British and Canadian units, highlighting the necessity of international cooperation. Logistics played an equally critical role, supply lines had to be maintained across storm-tossed seas, while air support had to anticipate German counterattacks. Every tank destroyed, every bridge captured, and every radio message transmitted represented a coordinated effort of unprecedented scale. By July, the Allies had established a foothold strong enough to begin a full-scale push into France, signaling that the war in Western Europe was entering its decisive phase. While the ground war raged, the skies above Europe became a theater of relentless air campaigns. American bombers targeted factories, railways, and communication centers deep within German territory, aiming to cripple industrial capacity and erode morale. The technological and logistical achievements of the U.S. military allowed for sustained bombing raids, with fighter escorts ensuring that American crews could reach their targets despite fierce Luftwaffe opposition. Civilian populations endured the consequences, with cities reduced to rubble and countless lives lost. The ethical dilemmas of strategic bombing weighed heavily on commanders and policymakers alike, yet the relentless air campaigns contributed directly to weakening Germany's ability to resist the advancing Allied armies. The liberation of Paris in August 1944 marked a symbolic and strategic victory. After 4 years under Nazi occupation, the French capital was finally free, and the morale boost for both soldiers and civilians was immense. American forces, pushing eastward, encountered increasingly desperate resistance as the German military, though battered, continued to employ defensive strategies and counterattacks. Battles in regions like Lorraine and the Ardennes demonstrated that victory would not come quickly or without sacrifice. The Allies relied on combined arms operations, integrating artillery, tanks, infantry, and air support in coordinated assaults that maximized their growing technological and numerical superiority. Amid the military operations, diplomacy continued to shape the larger picture. Roosevelt maintained communication with Churchill and Stalin, balancing the need for strategic unity with the competing ambitions of each ally. Stalin pressed for continued pressure on the Eastern Front to ensure that the Red Army could advance into Eastern Europe, a campaign critical for securing Soviet influence post-war. Roosevelt's skillful mediation ensured that these pressures did not fracture the coalition, demonstrating that leadership in wartime demanded both strategic vision and political acumen. Decisions made in London, Washington, and Moscow directly influenced the timing, scale, and direction of operations across the European continent. By late 1944, the Allies faced one of their greatest challenges, the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. Snow, fog, and surprise attacks tested the resilience of American and Allied forces, slowing their advance and inflicting significant casualties. Yet, the ability of U.S. divisions to hold defensive positions, regroup, and coordinate reinforcements ultimately blunted the German offensive. The battle underscored the evolving skill of American commanders and troops, who had matured from inexperienced soldiers into battle-hardened units capable of responding to even the most challenging scenarios. Each victory, costly as it was, pushed the Allies closer to Germany's borders and the ultimate goal of unconditional surrender. The campaigns of 1944 also highlighted the integration of new technologies and intelligence capabilities. Code-breaking efforts allowed the Allies to anticipate German movements, while innovations in logistics ensured that fuel, ammunition, and food reached forward positions efficiently. Amphibious vehicles, mechanized infantry, and long-range artillery enhanced mobility and firepower, giving U.S. forces an advantage in both offense and defense. The combination of human courage, industrial capacity, and technological innovation became the defining feature of the American approach to warfare in Europe, illustrating how a nation's organizational power could be leveraged alongside bravery and tactical skill to achieve monumental objectives. As 1944 drew to a close, the Allies had successfully liberated much of Western Europe, but the war was far from over. German forces remained entrenched in key positions, and the push into the heart of Germany would demand further planning, coordination, and sacrifice. Yet the lessons of the past year were clear: unity among allies, meticulous planning, and the willingness to adapt to unexpected circumstances could overcome even the most formidable opponent. The United States had transformed from a nation shocked into action at Pearl Harbor into a dominant force capable of shaping the course of a global conflict. Its soldiers, strategies, and innovations were now central to the fate of Europe, and the foundation had been laid for the final campaigns that would ultimately end the war in the West. The European campaigns of 1944 demonstrated that modern warfare was as much a test of planning, diplomacy, and coordination as it